I don't remember in detail every day of my life, do you?
No.
I mean, what did you have for breakfast yesterday? Unless you have the same thing every day, you probably don't remember. None of us remember in detail every day of our lives. We can't, but we do remember some days in great details. We remember the big days, big good days, days filled with celebration and great accomplishments and milestones. And we remember big bad days, days marked by pain and suffering, even terror. Well, I remember this day like it was yesterday, and it wasn't one of the good ones. It was November of 2003, a long time ago. Becky was about 4.5 months pregnant with our third child. Aubrey was 3.5, and Sterling was just a little over 1. Eli wasn't even here yet. So yeah, it was a long time ago. But to me, it feels like yesterday. We were together Becky and I were at the doctor's office for that mid-pregnancy ultrasound to check on our new little one and hopefully find out whether our third child was going to be a boy or a girl. As they did the ultrasound, the tech quickly announced that our new baby would be a little boy. We already had a boy name and a girl name picked out. So obviously we went with the boy name. His name would be Corin Dean. Dean was my Grandpa Goodwin's middle name. To me, the process felt pretty normal. The tech measured all the things she was supposed to measure. And then when she was done, I headed back to work while Becky waited to chat with the doctor. The test had seemed normal to me, but Becky later said that she'd noticed that the tech had kept repeating measurements of the same bones over and over and over again, like she was trying to make sure the numbers that she was seeing were correct. And then after I'd pulled out of the parking lot and was about 2 minutes down the road, I received a kind of a panicked call from Becky. The doctor needed to talk to us about something. Something about little Corin, it seems, wasn't right. So I quickly turned around. I rushed back to the doctor's office. I hoped against hope that this was much ado about nothing. When I walked back into the room where Becky was waiting, I could see the fear and anxiety etched on her face. And the doctor finally came in and told us that some of Corin's bones in his arms and legs and also in his rib cage weren't measuring as long as they should be compared to the rest of his body. And so she set us up with a specialist from DeVos in Grand Rapids who came up to Munson Hospital here in Traverse City about once a month, every once in a while, to work with couples whose babies were showing problems in the womb. And so a month later, in December of 2003, we sat in another room, much like the room in the doctor's office we'd been in a month before, only this one was inside Munson Hospital. And this time, the tech took all of the same measurements from the previous ultrasound. It did all the same things. This time, that highly trained specialist physician was looking over the tech's shoulder, describing exactly what he wanted to see. It didn't take him long to realize what was happening. He'd seen it before. And he turned to us, and with genuine sadness in his eyes and his voice, the sadness of a man who delivered this kind of news to frightened couples more times than he could count without allowing himself to get callous and jaded, he turned to us and said, "Your son has a very serious condition. It's a type of dwarfism known as thanatophoric dysplasia. And this type of dwarfism is incompatible with life. He will not be able to survive outside of the womb." Incompatible with life. I'll never forget that phrase. thanatophoric dysplasia. Thanatos is the Greek word for death. Many of our medical terms come from the Greek language. Thanatophoric dysplasia, a death-bringing dwarfism. Incompatible with life. His exceptionally small chest, which was small because the bones there in his rib cage weren't growing to their proper length, just like the bones in his arms and legs weren't. It wouldn't be able to expand, meaning his lungs wouldn't be able to fill with air. Well, 3 months later, on March 10th, 2004, we made our way back to Munson for the delivery and what we knew would then be the death of our precious baby boy. Because his arms and legs were abnormally short, Becky didn't feel a lot of movement inside her the way she'd felt Aubrey and Sterling. But the day before we went into Munson, she'd felt him moving around. It was like he was saying, "I'm here, Mama, I'm here." And so on March 10th, 2004, Corin Dean was delivered by C-section, as all of our children were. And the nurses, instead of taking him to work on him, they handed him directly to me to hold where Becky could see him. He cried once as his lungs tried to fill, and I baptized him right there in the operating room. They handed me a little seashell with some water in it, and I baptized him there. And then Becky and I held him as they finished up the procedure on her, and they moved us quickly into a private room where Becky held him in her arms, me by her side, until a little less than an hour after he was born, he died. Now, Becky's dream had been to have a large family, 4 kids, from the start. She wanted a big family. And several months later, we were ready to try again. Now, when a family has an infant die, the next one born, if they have another child, is called their rainbow baby. The beauty after the terrible storm, and a reminder of the faithfulness of God. And our rainbow baby, Ezekiel Dean, he would carry his older brother's middle name, was born on August 10th, 2005. We called him Zeke for short. And because we got to pick his birth date, because all of our kids were born by C-section, we picked the 10th of the month he was due, in honor of his brother as well. 3 years after that, Eli came along, a bundle of energy and enthusiasm with a propensity for getting himself into places he wasn't supposed to be in. I once found him sitting inside the rabbit hutch with the rabbit hutch door closed with the rabbit. He's deathly allergic to rabbits, by the way. Eli was the total opposite of Zeke. I remember Becky telling me, though, as she looked at our 4 kids, she was looking in the rearview mirror. We were pulling out of the driveway. She was driving a Yukon XL, same as a Suburban. Aubrey and Sterling and Zeke and little Eli. She said, "This is it. I'm happy. I'm content. This is what I wanted." Zeke was a quiet, thoughtful kid. He didn't really talk much until he was almost 3. A friend of ours who is a speech pathologist always told us, "He's fine, don't worry, he'll talk when he's ready." And he did. But he was always a kid short on words and long on observation and listening. He had a rich inner imagination life. He spent so much time out in our yard throwing a baseball into a pitchback, a net that's stretched over a frame that bounces the ball back to you when you throw it. And then he'd catch it in his glove and he'd throw it again. He was pretending to be pitching and fielding for the Detroit Tigers. And he spent so much time out there doing that he wore a bare spot in the yard. During football season, he'd go out and he'd stand just inside the door to one of the barns. And then he'd run out into the yard and jump up and down like he was leading his Trojans onto the field. Or maybe the Lions. If he ever misbehaved, which was rare, even during the terrible threes. Becky and I did not experience the terrible twos with our kids. It was the terrible threes. Just a look from either one of us could reduce him to tears. The biggest hissy fit he ever threw, I think, was when he threatened to never eat again if we didn't let him live at Disney World. Susan can relate. He did that as we were leaving Disney World after vacationing there with the kids over spring break one year. Fortunately, he was eating before we got out of Florida. But he did say, if you don't let me live here, I will never eat again. In 2012, he was old enough to take a 4-H project to the fair with the 4-H club that Becky and I had been leading, and he took our pony, his pony now, Bella. He was so proud to sit there on top of his tack box, beside his stall, and show her off. He couldn't wait for Wednesday, special Kids Day and Kids Day. Still is to this day at the fair. Kids get in free and they can walk around. 4-Hers have their animals up close where kids can pet them. He was so excited to stand there in Bella's stall and let other kids pet his pony, proudly wearing his bright red 4-H Club t-shirt. And so on the morning of August 8th, 2012, he jumped out of bed in our camper, and he pulled on his club t-shirt, and he got on his bike, and he excitedly headed toward the horse barn to feed his pony and clean her stall, with my help, of course. But he never made it to the barn. A truck driving in front of him stopped and then suddenly backed up. The driver didn't realize that he was there, and he backed over him. After being rushed to Munson and then flown to DeVos in Grand Rapids, he was taken off. We made the decision to take him off life support shortly after midnight, and he died a little while later. In the early morning hours of August 9th, 2012, he died in Becky's arms, with me sitting beside her, just one day shy of his 7th birthday. Our rainbow baby taken from us too. What do we do when suffering strikes? Where do we turn when the darkness closes in around us? Turn with me to Psalm 129 and 130. These psalms are 2 of the 15 psalms of ascent found in the book of Psalms. We find them in the book as Psalms 120 to 134. The Psalms of Ascent. They're a small collection of psalms, and they were intended to be sung by Jewish pilgrims as they made their way from their homes and villages around Israel to Jerusalem for the great Jewish feasts and celebrations. Jerusalem is in the hill country, and it is set on a hill, so as the travelers ascended into Jerusalem, they sang these songs. Let's look first at Psalm 129. Greatly they have afflicted me from my youth. Let Israel now say, greatly have they afflicted me from my youth, yet they have not prevailed against me. The plowers plowed upon my back. They made long their furrows. The Lord is righteous. He has cut the cords of the wicked. Make all who hate Zion be put to shame and turn backward. Let them be like the grass on the housetops, which withers before it grows up, with which the reaper does not fill his hand, nor the binder of sheaves his arms. Nor do those who pass by say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. The psalmist begins, and he writes this psalm about suffering that comes because of other people. People who treat you poorly, unfairly, or in meanness. People who wrong you. I mean, look at the image he uses. Look at verse 3. The plowers plowed upon my back. He says, like I'm laying on the ground, or even like I am the ground, and farmers plowing the ground are running their plow And even in that day, we're well into the Iron Age now. They have metal. They're using metal on their plows. They're running their plow right down my back. He's talking about real pain and suffering here, but it's pain and suffering that's caused by the actions of others. He's talking about those times when we're hurt by someone else. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth. The plowers plowed upon my back. But then he says this. Look at verse 4. The Lord is righteous. Now, righteous we often think of in terms of like being perfect, being really, really good, being holy. And it kind of has that connotation. But righteousness always happens. The word is always used within the context of a relationship. It's talking about right relationship. Good, close, intimate, healthy relationship. Rightness. Righteous. It's not so much about being good in general. It's about being in a whole and healthy relationship. God, he says, is righteous. In other words, he wants relationship with me. And so what does he do? He has cut the cords of the wicked. What does that mean? He's talking about the harness that enables the ox to pull the plow. He's cut the harness. They may still be running back and forth over me, but they cannot destroy me. Why? Because God has rendered their efforts fruitless and impotent. They may be able to cause me pain and deep, deep suffering, but they cannot touch my heart, and they cannot touch my soul, and they cannot do a single thing to take me out of the hand of a Father who in righteousness loves me. No matter what happens to me on any given day, no matter what happens to me in this life because of the actions of other people, no matter what anyone says about me or says to me or does to me, my eternal destiny in the presence of God is secure. And then he says, may all who hate Zion, the people of God, be put to shame and turn backward. Let them be like the grass on the housetops. They made their roofs out of mud and dirt a lot of the times over there. And, when the wind blows, seeds scatter, and sometimes your roof would start to sprout. Kind of like ours do with moss these days, right? If you have your roof under a tree, but it would start to sprout. But the mud wasn't thick enough to really support growth, to support life. And so it would kind of sprout overnight. It's got the dew, it's got the coolness. And then as the heat turned up during the day, it would wither and die. It says, let them be like the grass on the housetops, which withers before it grows up. A reaper can't fill his hand with any of that. You can't bind it in sheaves. No one's going to go by and say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. May your harvest be plentiful, the harvest from that roof of yours. No one's going to say that. It's a joke. The efforts of those who hate us in the hands of God are a joke. They may trample us, but they cannot permanently harm us. You see, following Jesus isn't a weak, fragile life. A plant that only flourishes when the conditions are just right, when the going is easy and the rain plentiful and the sun warm, or when your business is successful and the money is ample and your spouse good looking and everyone likes you and all the traffic lights turn green as you approach. It's more like a tough, indestructible perennial that keeps going regardless of conditions. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus. We have to be tough sometimes. Look at the life of St. Paul. Look at what he said about his own life after he gave it to Christ. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 through 29. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I mean, he's keeping track. He's got a diary. My persecution diary. Let's see. I got beat again today. Make another tick mark there. All right? Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Probably not somebody you'd like to take with you on a cruise. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. The Mediterranean has sharks too, by the way. On frequent journeys, I was always traveling, in other words, in danger from rivers that are swollen and water's running fast. Danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. Is there anywhere he wasn't in danger? In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. And then he says, if you're weak, I'm not. Who's weak and I'm not weak? In other words, I feel the pain of the people in all the churches I've started. This is what it looks like to have tough faith. To have perseverance, to be able to keep going even when it's hard. And the darkness closes in around you. Reminds me of this weed that grows in our yard. It's called plantain weed, and we tend to see it in late June and early into July after the first dandelion growth, which is probably starting about now. After that dies out, parts of our yard are full of these plantain weeds. They have this really long stem with a little teeny cone-shaped top, little white dots around it. And the thing that drives me nuts about these things is that I can drive over them with my lawnmower that has 3 steel sharpened blades spinning, cutting the grass, and you can drive over them with the mower and look back and see like 76 of those stupid things standing up laughing at you. It's like those stupid stems are stronger than sharpened steel. I hate those things. Every once in a while, Becky will see me and I'll be driving like this all of a sudden. I'm like, what am I doing? Well, I'm trying to knock those stupid things down. But you can't. Or it's like the sedum that grows out behind the church, Randy's Bane, every summer. Where the soil is really, really sandy. Grass won't grow there. Even dandelions won't grow there. But sedum just keeps on living. Flooding rains, no problem. We'll just breathe underwater. We're like, drought, the exact opposite. No problem. We're like camels. You want to drive on us and park on us? No problem. We're stronger than asphalt. Spray us with weed killer. We drink that stuff like water. Those weeds just keep going, and no matter how hard you try, you can't snuff them out. You can't cut them. You can't kill them. You can't mow them. You can't drown them. You can't burn them up in the sun. They just keep going. Why? They're tough and persistent. But that toughness and persistence doesn't come from our own inner grit and determination or anything about us. Yes, authentic faith in Jesus is filled with grit and determination, but our grit and determination doesn't find its source in ourselves and our own toughness. It finds its source in God's faithfulness. The psalmist says, "The Lord is righteous. He has cut the cords of the wicked." When your life is in God's hands, yes, you will feel pain. And yes, you will still suffer, just as those who don't follow Jesus do. But the efforts of those who hurt you will be rendered eternally ineffective, even though they may hurt you now. Now look over at Psalm 130. Out of the depths, I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? but with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. This psalm changes tone just slightly from the grit and persistence of a tough faith that's grounded in God's faithfulness. He has cut the cords that tie the plow to the ox. It's not grounded in our own strength, when others hurt us. The psalmist goes from that to suffering in general. Before, the psalmist felt like he was laying on the ground being run over by a plow. Now he feels as if he's drowning. And when I am seeing someone in therapy who is dealing with grief, the image of drowning is the image I use. And this psalmist feels like he's drowning. Out of the depths I cry to you. I'm drowning here, God. Where are you? I can't see you. I can't hear you. Are you there? He's gone from specifically the pain and suffering that's caused by others to pain and suffering in general, the suffering that sometimes just happens to us. Well, one of the things I love about the Psalms, and I've often said this, is that they're an honest look at the inner life of those who follow Jesus in every season of life. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And life for all of us ebbs and flows into and out of each one of those, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We all face suffering. We all face adversity in this life. We will all experience pain. Sometimes we suffer because our bodies break or they get sick or we develop problems in our minds and our emotions. Sometimes societal systems cause suffering, poverty, bias and oppression, illness and injury and disease. Mental and emotional challenges, they can all cause suffering. So can the intentional or even the unintentional actions of others. We live in a broken world, and sometimes things just go wrong, even in the safety of a mother's womb. Sometimes we suffer because we follow Jesus. And actually following Jesus, really following Jesus, doesn't often make sense to those who aren't following Jesus. It's like we're driving the wrong way down a one-way street. At best, it's annoying. At worst, it can seem downright dangerous to those who aren't following Jesus because we go against the flow of societies and cultures and empires. Our values are different. Our perspectives are different. Sometimes we suffer too. So we suffer because of things happen. We suffer sometimes because we follow Jesus, and sometimes we suffer because we're being tempted. Tempted to give up or give in. Tempted to just stop following Jesus altogether. Or more likely, just not necessarily follow him fully in the situation we're facing. Still kind of following Jesus, but not really, and I'm not in this instance. To compromise in an area where we shouldn't. We call that adversity. The word adversity comes from the same root as the word adversary. And in Satan, we have an adversary who, Peter tells us, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And he will never be more active than when you are facing adversity that he didn't necessarily cause, but he can use it to get you to quit or to compromise. So what do we do with gritty, tough faith when we're suffering or when we're facing adversity? We cry out to God. Look at verses 2 through 4. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. It's almost like he's saying, God, I don't know if you can even hear me now. please hear me. I can't see you. I can't feel you. I don't know where you are. Please hear me. Help me. I can't do this. And then going on in verse 3, if you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. When we're suffering, we're usually looking for someone to blame for our suffering. And if no one else is to blame, we often blame ourselves. And even if there is someone else to blame, we blame ourselves. Am I to blame? Am I going through this because God is getting me because I didn't get up and read 5 chapters of my Bible this morning? Because my heart is full of sin? Is God doing this because God doesn't like me? Or because God is punishing me? Am I to blame? Why would God help me? I'm not worthy of God's love. God is punishing me. In the months after Corin died, Becky often cried and said, I feel like this is happening because I'm not a good mom to Aubrey and Sterling. Now, she's a great mom. She's the best mom. With them, usually gentle. With others, especially when they threaten or hurt one of her children, she's fierce. Like you don't want to go there. Because she will take you out. And my job is just to show up with a shovel and an alibi. That fear that this is happening because I'm not a good mom, that wasn't true. It wasn't based in reality, but the feeling was there, and the feeling was very real. And it's something that we all do when we're suffering. God is doing this to punish me because I'm not good enough. And yes, sometimes we do suffer because of our own sin. We break a law. We wind up with a hefty fine or a jail sentence. We fail morally, we lose our marriage or our job, and we're humiliated. But not all suffering is our own fault, a direct result of our sin. In fact, one of the main complaints of the psalmists throughout the book of Psalms is that far too often it seems like good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people who aren't in the moment doing anything wrong. But even when our suffering isn't the result of our own sin, we know we're still sinners. We do miss the mark. We know we do fall short. But we have to remember that God's forgiveness is real and complete. I love the question the psalmist asks here in verse 5, or verse 4. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? It's like he's reminding himself that the answer there is no one. We often suffer because we live in a fallen, broken world, not because of any specific thing we have done. He's reminding himself that if suffering always came because we're doing something wrong, because we've offended God, we'd all suffer all the time. But I want you to notice something here too. The psalmist offers no explanation for suffering. This is not a philosophical or theological treatise to explain suffering. Those things exist. But he doesn't offer any here. He simply acknowledges 2 important truths. Suffering is real, and so is God. So we cry out to God, and we do so in hope. Look at verses 5 and 6. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. And in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. Most ancient cultures had walled cities with people living in them or at least near them, and the people who lived outside but nearby could take shelter behind those walls in times of danger. And those walls were guarded by watchmen. Now, most cultures had 4 6-hour watches each night, meaning that no watchman had to be on duty for more than 6 hours during the day or night. But the Jews had 3 8-hour watches. That's the way they did it. So each watchman was on for 8 hours instead of 6. When it comes to alertness and the ability to pay attention, things required of watchmen, of guards, there is a huge difference between 6 hours and 8 hours. Jewish watches were long. They were tiring. And the picture here is of a long and anguished night watch and wait. In our suffering, we watch and we wait. And watching plus waiting equals hope. Look at verses 7 and 8. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love. In other words, His love is there, no matter what's happening to you. And with Him is plentiful redemption, and He will redeem Israel from all its iniquities. In his book on the Psalms of Ascent, a book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. I love that title because that's what's pictured here. A long obedience in the same direction. Perseverance, toughness, and hope. The author of that book, Eugene Peterson, writes this: hoping does not mean doing nothing. It isn't fatalistic resignation. It means going about our assigned tasks, confident that God will provide the meaning to our suffering and the conclusions to our suffering. Hope is not compelled to work away at keeping up appearances with bogus spirituality, kind of like we're not acknowledging that we do suffer, that we are hurting, that we are in pain. That's bogus spirituality. Instead, we can acknowledge that we are suffering and that it hurts. Hope is the opposite, he says, of desperation and panicky manipulation, scurrying and worrying. And hoping is not dreaming. It's not spinning an illusion or a fantasy to protect us from our boredom and our pain. It means a confident, alert expectation, like a watchman, that God will do what He said He will do. It is imagination put in the harness of faith. It is a willingness to let God do it His way and in His time. You see, the source of our hope is God's full redemption. Redemption from our sin and a restored relationship with God. And ultimately, that is redemption completed when everything is made new. It's a hope based on the solid foundation of God's redeeming work, the work He accomplished through Jesus. And it's a hope that looks forward to the day when He will bring it to its full and final completion. A day talked about by the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, where he says, "Behold, at this time it will look like this. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. And He will dwell with them, and they will be His people. And God Himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes." What does that assume? That we do cry. And death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. And He who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Also He said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." He is the one we place our hope in. Yes, we suffer. We face adversity and we deal with deep, deep pain. But those of us who follow Jesus know that He has already rendered any attack ineffective in stealing us away from Him. And so we cry out to Him in hope. A hope firmly grounded in God's faithfulness to us, that God will do in God's time what God has said He will do. And that He will bring us to a place where every tear is wiped from our eyes, where every wrong is made right, even wrongs that happened, in the safety of a mother's womb, where redemption is complete and sin is finally and fully destroyed, where we will see loved ones who were taken from us too soon again, and the light of Christ will shine on all that is. That's our hope. So yeah, I still cry. After Zeke died, 2 people who had experienced the loss of children in their lives came to me and said, one said it changes, but it never really goes away. Another one said, I lost my son 50 years ago. I still have. He said, I don't cry so much anymore, but I still have really dark days. I know what that feels like because I still have those days, those times. Sometimes it's a moment, sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's a day when I just miss him and I feel sad. But I know that there will be a day when I see him again. So, when you're talking to someone who is suffering, it's not the time to tell your story too. It's time to listen. Because telling your story too in that moment often feels like you're trying to one-up somebody. And this isn't a competition, at least a competition anybody wants to win. And it's okay for that person to cry. And it's okay for you to cry. Because we do suffer and we do feel pain, and we need to acknowledge that. And with the psalmist, cry out, God, do you hear me? Please hear me. Because sometimes we don't understand. The psalmist doesn't offer deep theological and philosophical explanations. He just reminds us of 2 things. Suffering is real, and so is God. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your great love for us. Thank you that you have broken the cords on the plow, and that you are bringing all of human history to your desired conclusion, and you will make all things right. And that is our hope. And we place our trust in you this morning. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.